What I want to do is introduce to you the development of our quality of life instrument, and Erin and I have over the last few years built a quality of life measurement tool for bipolar disorder, and I want to describe very briefly how we did that and why we did that. So, if you think about it, one of the main things we need to do with any medical or psychiatric or psychological condition is measure very clearly what it is we want to achieve when we're working with someone with that condition. So with bipolar disorder, for example, it's pretty obvious that we might want to measure symptoms of mania or depression. But what's important to appreciate is that's not the whole story. There's a whole other part of the experience of bipolar disorder that's nothing to do, well, it's related, but it's important to also measure. It's not just the symptoms, it's not just the mania and the depression. It's also the experience of what you might call quality of life. And we get this idea because when you speak to anyone with any medical condition, and if you say to them, what do you want to get out of the treatment? They don't say, I want less pain, or I want more flexibility in my joints, or I want less mania. What they say is, I want to be able to play with the kids, I want to be able to get back to work, I want to be able to get my relationship going better. These are features of quality of life. So the exact same things that matter for everybody matter whether you've got bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or arthritis or whatever. So there's a growing interest in medicine and psychiatry and psychology in this concept of quality of life. And one of the first things you need to appreciate about that is that you might think that quality of life, and say if we're talking about bipolar disorder, that quality of life and symptoms are just sort of the opposite of each other, like the more symptoms, the less quality of life. To some extent that's true, but it's not completely true. The correlation is not that strong. Quality of life is in some ways distinct from symptoms of mania and depression. And Erin and I realised, in fact Erin started this work a decade before I got on board, realised that there wasn't an instrument, a tool, a questionnaire that would pick up on this quality of life concept as it applies specifically to bipolar disorder. So she had the idea of developing the first disorder-specific quality of life measure, and I was lucky enough to be around when she decided to do that, and she invited me on board. So she and I worked together for quite a long time in doing this. And over the next couple of minutes I want to explain to you the steps that are involved in developing such an instrument, because it actually it's pretty complicated, and that's why no one had done it before. And so, yeah, I just want to lead you through the steps of what it involves. One thing to say first, there are already existing questionnaire measures of quality of life generally. So, you know, there are measures that we give out in huge population surveys to see how people's quality of life is, and measure the quality of life in Vancouver compared to Melbourne. I don't know if you know this, but Melbourne is the world's most livable city. We just knocked Vancouver off the top of the list, but that's another story. So there's what we call generic quality of life measures, and then there's quality of life measures specific for particular conditions. So there's quality of life in arthritis, quality of life in schizophrenia, quality of life in cancer. What there hasn't been is a quality of life in bipolar disorder instrument. But we have been measuring quality of life in bipolar disorder using these generic instruments, and so that was one of our challenges, was to make sure that our new instrument did something different to what these generic instruments already do. And in fact we've got some data that shows that our new instrument clearly adds value or adds information over those existing generic instruments. So how do you develop a quality of life instrument specifically for a disorder? Well, what you need to do first is go and ask people with the disorder, and people who work with the disorder, and family members of people with the disorder. Go and ask them what matters in terms of quality of life for those people. So this research is very much from the ground up. You need to understand what it's like from the person's perspective, what quality of life means for them. And so our first step was literally that. We conducted a series of focus group interviews and individual interviews where we literally asked that question, what does quality of life mean to you? Or we went to professionals sometimes and said, what do you think quality of life means for your patients with bipolar disorder? And out of that we got a huge list of concepts, and in fact we started with I think it was 210 initial questions or statements that we thought were relevant, that people had told us were relevant to their quality of life. And then we took these this initial list of lots and lots of statements. So it might be, for example, a statement, quality of life is important in the area of physical exercise. So physical exercise might be one of the items that we're going to ask about. And then there might be another one, quality of life is very, for me, quality of life relates to how I get on with my partner in my intimate relationship. So you can imagine there'd be a huge long list. Now that huge long list is a starting point for a questionnaire, but it's not the end point, because no one's going to complete a questionnaire with 210 items. So we needed to go back and make sure that we got the minimum possible set of items that captured the concept that these people seem to be telling us. So the first step in that, after we'd done all these interviews, even before the interviews, we started with a literature review. So everything that had been written about quality of life, we collected that and we sat down together with other people and bounced ideas around, said it's probably going to be this, we think it's that, it's not so much this. So we had a general idea first. Then we conducted the interviews and got, as it were, words from people's own mouths. We actually wanted, the words that made sense to these people, and that's what our items were. So that was step 2, was those interviews. And then so we had this huge long list of items, and then we took those back to people with bipolar disorder, and we got them to comment on what they thought was the quality of those items. Did they capture, for these people with bipolar disorder, important features of quality of life for bipolar disorder? So they rated the items for us. So they did a scientific exercise on the items. So we asked them, do these items make sense to you? Can you understand what we're trying to tap? And we asked them, how important are these items in terms of quality of life? And through that process, we ended up with a set of 139 items then, so we threw some out. And at this stage, the items were starting to cluster into areas. So we had 13 different areas at that time. So one of them, I think, was social, one of them, I think, was work, and another was study, and you can sort of guess what the domains of life might be. And so we're starting to chunk these into areas. And that chunking is important, because you get to start to ask yourself questions. Well, if we're going to have chunks, we need to have enough items or enough questions in each chunk to be able to measure it reliably. So it's this process where you're getting rid of individual items but also protecting these chunks. So at the first cut, we had 139 items in 13 areas. And that's where we did, at that point, we went into the next stage, which was a very, very big survey study. And we had 225 people with bipolar disorder. We checked their diagnosis, so Erin and her colleagues here in Canada did most of this work. They checked the diagnosis and got them to complete this 139 item questionnaire, so it's heading towards our final product. And in fact, of those 225 people, 93 of them actually did it twice. They did it about 7 days later. And that's very important, because, as you can imagine, what we're trying to work out is how stable this concept is of quality of life. It shouldn't change too much between, Wednesday one week and Wednesday the next week. There shouldn't be dramatic changes in people's quality of life, but there should be some change, because, maybe their work's going a bit better, or maybe there's been some change in their symptoms. We wanted to check what happens across time with the instrument. So we had 225 people complete it, and of those, 93 completed it twice. But remember, at this stage, the questionnaire was too long. It had 139 items, so we needed to wheedle it down. As a result of that process, we ended up with an instrument with 91 items and 14 different domains. So one of the areas had got split into 2, and that's the point where we actually lifted out a specific sleep quality domain. That sounded, at that point, which this is an idea that's been important in bipolar disorder for a long time, the importance of sleep, and in our data it started to arise as something we needed to include as a specific domain. So we actually had 14 domains at that time. So we had an instrument then with 91 items, 14 areas, and we took it back to the CREST group. We had 40 people look over it again, and basically we said to them at that stage, these are the 14 areas that we need measured, here's 91 items, what are the best 4 items in each area, because we've got too many items and we want the same number of items in each area to make them all similarly reliable. You need a little bunch of items to be able to explore a concept reliably, and so we just gave that job back to people with bipolar disorder. We said, you tell us, which do you think are the 4 best items in each area? And they did that, and we ended up with a 56 item, 14 domain instrument called the Quality of Life BD, the Qual BD, the Quality of Life in Bipolar Disorder. And that's the instrument that you can see on our website, so you can see how it looks. It's designed in a very, what we call a face valid way. There's no tricks to it. You know, you read the item and what you think is the meaning of the item, that is what we mean, and there's no sort of hidden questions there. It's all entirely transparent, so you can have a look at those items and you'll see, just by reading the items, what we think is the best way to measure quality of life in bipolar disorder. We then thought, as the final step, that this instrument, as 56 items, that might not work in some settings, especially research settings. So we developed a short version of the instrument as well, and that's called the Brief Quality of Life in Bipolar Disorder. And what that is 12 items, so it's a very brief instrument which measures the 12 of the 14 domains in the Qual BD. Just to be clear about this, 12 and 14. So in the full 56 item Qual BD, there are 14 domains, but the last 2 only get completed if one of them is work and one of them is study. So if you're not working, you don't complete the work bit. If you're not studying, you don't complete the study bit. So take those 2 out. There's 12 what we call the core domains, and the Brief Quality of Life instrument has 1 question, the best question from each of those 12 domains of life. And you can go on the web and have a look at what those are. It's very easy to see how that works. So we have this 56 item Quality of Life instrument for bipolar disorder. We have the 12 item brief instrument, and really we're wrapped at this 5 years of work with this input from lots of people, including the CREST community, but lots of other people, has really, I think, succeeded in creating the first bipolar disorder specific quality of life measure. And we're also excited that people have been continually contacting us since we published this about a year ago from all around the world, wanting to translate it into different languages. So I think we have 6 different languages which it will be translated into shortly. That process is currently ongoing. So that's it from me.